Yeah, you ready for me? Yep. Okay. All right, hello everybody. Welcome back. I know it's been a while, so here we are back with the Distinguished Speaker Series. Today it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Richard Landers. Dr. Landers is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota. Prior to that, he was an associate professor of psychology at Old Dominion University, which in academic circles, this is quite the leap and well-deserved, as you'll see, to go from Old Dominion to, which is a fine school, as we discussed, but to go to the University of Minnesota. Those of you who are IO psychologists know what a big deal it is to be a professor at the University of Minnesota. Not only that, he is the John P. Campbell Distinguished Professor of Industrial Organizational Psychology, so that is a named faculty position, which is also a big deal. Richard is known for his research on innovative tech and psychometric assessments, including employee selection, which is some of the stuff he'll be talking about with us today. He has more than 50 publications. I couldn't quite tell exactly how many, but it's around about or more than 50 publications in the Journal of Applied Psychology, Journal of Business and Psychology, Psych Methods, and Computers and Human Behavior. Among those publications, he has more than 2,000 citations. Some of those papers are in the 400 citation counts. An H-index of 18 for those of you who know what that means. His work has also been featured in public outlets such as Forbes, Engadget, New Scientist, Business Insider, and Popular Science. He's on the advisory board for Aon Hewitt, as a scientific advisory board member. He also does consulting for a number of startup companies who do work in the personnel selection and employee selection space. And we are really pleased to have him here today to talk about a very hot topic that I know many of us are interested in, which is gamification. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Richard Landers.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about both games and gamified assessment. To start that, well, to give you a structure for a little bit, I'm going to actually talk about how those are two very different things. They share common research literature, but are different concepts. And then go into details about two specific research studies that we've conducted on these two topics to give you a kind of a flavor of how different they are. And to open that, I'm going to ask you a question. Is this a game? So this is something, something, soup, something. It's the name, something, something, soup, something. It's a game you can play at this website right here. It was created by a philosopher. And what this person was interested in trying to figure out is, what are people's definitions of soup? So what happens, the plot of this game, we're in some kind of future, maybe a few hundred years down the road, and Earth, poor Earth, we've run out of food. Just totally destroy the planet, no more food left. Fortunately, some very friendly aliens passing by say, oh, we can provide food, but we don't really know what humans eat. So we need to bring people from Earth to tell us, is this soup or not? So what happens is you will see a picture like this in the game, and you're asked to make a judgment. You see the button right here, no, not soup, and presumably some Earthlings will starve somewhere. So the goal is to then feed as many Earthlings soup as you can. And what the game will do as you progress is it will change certain parameters of this. So right now you have a liquid with celery and seaweed served in a coconut with an ice cream scoop. Is that soup or not? I think most people say it's probably soup. And so then it'll say, oh, well, you said yes to these parameters. If instead of seaweed, I'm serving you bolts, like metal bolts. What if instead of a hollowed out coconut, it's served in a human skull? That's the range you get. And what the game will actually do is, as you do this, it will try to work out your definition of soup based on these two buttons. And it will change and try to get in on exactly what you think soup is. So for me, when I experienced this, I said, that's a rating instrument. Oh, this is essentially an adaptive test that judges between true and false answers. And yet, this was created by a philosopher, a person expert in game design with absolutely zero expertise in testing whatsoever. This is actually a pretty common problem in games, is trying to develop ways to figure out what the player's skill level is in real time as they're playing the game. That's a super common problem. So what this says to me is, wow, there's a sort of like shadow group of people that have developed their own version of assessment have developed adaptive tests with zero interest, zero understanding of traditional assessment methodologies, and have integrated these kind of assessment platforms into games. This became my entry point. This is where I said, what is the real potential here? If we actually took rigorous psychometric instrument development methods and we applied them in this game context, what could we get out of that? This is actually a problem you don't see very often. It's actually working out individual operationalizations of the word soup. And this person actually came out and said, wow, people have a big variety in definitions of soup, and you can actually see different categories. I mean, it's really quite extensive. So yeah, this kind of inspired me to say, what could we potentially do with this? I see what's already been done. What are the possibilities? To understand exactly whether that's a game or not, which is another big question, we have to dig a little bit deeper. The major distinction that you have to be aware of to figure out whether something is a game, because I said it looks like a rating instrument, is it really a game, is this distinction between play versus games. So play is this unstructured, instinctive way that children interact with the world. If you've ever been around like a 1, 2, 3-year-old, they touch everything, they pick up things, they taste them, they throw things, they'll hit you with them. Just this sort of experimentation that children will engage in by default without any instruction in doing so. That's play. Experimenting with the world around you just to see what happens. So play with a set of rules is a game. So when you take that sort of instinctive, that instinctive way that we just kind of poke at things and see what happens, and we add a rule system. For example, we're no longer just playing on the playground. You need to follow me. Now you create a game. It's not we're just playing and doing whatever we want. We've added a rule to it. So children pass back and forth between this play and game distinction totally freely. If you've ever heard a kid yell, "I'm not playing," what that kid is really saying is, I reject your rules. I'm no longer playing your game. I'm going to play my way. That's that line. That's a concept that the Danish philosopher Hu Xing called the magic circle. That when you're inside the magic circle, you're saying, I accept your rules. And you jump outside, you're saying, I reject your rules. I'm no longer playing your game. So that's the distinction between play and games. It's really easier to compare extremes. I have a picture of Duplos over here. You can play with Duplos. There's no inherent way, correct or incorrect way to play with them. This is Super Mario Odyssey for the Nintendo Switch, which is very clearly a game. There are specific rules imposed on what you're allowed to do with your character. There's specific rules around how everything interacts with everything else in this virtual world. So it's easier to say, oh, this is a play object, an object to play, and this is a game, but there is a vast middle ground that gets a little bit hard to distinguish. So when I say play and I say games, I'm really referring to those two extremes, at least to make this a little easier today. Okay. So how do you make a game then? If your goal is to create a situation where play occurs, but add some rules to it in a way that people find interesting, what do you do? And there's a lot of different frameworks, or there are a lot of different frameworks for doing that. One of the most common now is MDA, which is mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. Mechanics are the rules of the game. Dynamics are the interactions that occur as a result of mechanics interacting with each other and a person interacting with mechanics. And aesthetics are the emotional connections we have to dynamics. And I will go in way more depth about that in just a minute. Ultimately, in order to create a game, one has to go through this sort of interrelated systems design process, where you create lots of individual little systems and so that they work together to create some targeted experience. In the Super Mario Odyssey example that I just gave you, there's rules about how the player interacts with the world around them, how objects interact with each other, and so on. Those are the rules that you have to create. Creating a game, super expensive, takes a lot of time. The most expensive game ever made, Grand Theft Auto 5, which is $265 million to create that game. But it did earn $800 million in the first 24 hours it was released, and at least estimates right now $1.5 billion to date. If you weren't aware, the video game market now is 51% of the entertainment industry, meaning all film, all TV, all music, all books. Video game is bigger than all of them combined. So video games is a massive market, huge amount of money being thrown at things. Your modern AAA title, that's the best of the best games that you commonly associate with video games, the Call of Duties, that kind of thing, typically in the $20 to $30 million range. You're involving, in most cases, between 500 and 1,000 individual employees to create a common game, okay, of that scale. Indie games can be real cheap. The independent games market, much like the difference between big studio films and indie films, you can really scope that down pretty far. You lose certain quality bits, but it's still possible to make a really nice game that is wildly successful with an indie budget. A real common example of that is Minecraft, which started as an indie game and then just exploded, eventually got purchased by Microsoft. All of this, though, complicated, and the question then is, why? What is it that makes that so, why are so many people involved? Why is it so complex to make something like that? The answer is that game design involves a lot of independent moving parts, a lot of individual systems that work together. The most fundamental of those are game mechanics at the bottom. So what a game mechanic is literally a rule or a set of rules built into a system that enables you to, that you use a VR headset, those are mechanics. Avatars, how are you represented in the game? In that Super Mario example, Mario is the avatar. Risk-taking, victory conditions, the idea that you can win in general. Like, that's not a normal life idea that you can just win in life, depending on who you ask. Most of the time, though, that would be limited to this kind of games context also. So these are the kind of decisions, the implementations that people can make in a game. So to illustrate that a bit, let's look at this game. The most popular video game ever made, Tetris, which I imagine most, if not everyone here, has probably played at some point, some version of it. Basic premise, if you don't know Tetris, is simply to create these four complete line matches of blocks, and when you create a complete line, you get points for doing so. If you're able to clear more than one line at a time, you get more points. So the goal in general to get as many points as fast as you can. The game mechanics here are quite varied, and more than you'd think. This is one of the simplest games, digital games around today, but here is just a partial list of the different systems that have been put in place, the game mechanics used to create what we think of as Tetris. There's a rotation system. Someone had to actually decide, well, how do you know where a piece turns? If you think about Tetris pieces, like say you have a 4-block line, so you have square, 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 your standard like 4-block straight line. That when somebody hits a button, it rotates. Where? Does it rotate on the end? Does it rotate at point 2, point 3, point 4? That's actually a question that you have to ask and play test and experiment with different versions of for that one piece. And yet we have a whole family of pieces, and that decision has to be made similarly for the entire thing. All of that works into a rotation system, which is an independent system that can be tested. All the different versions of that, literally hundreds of decisions just on how to turn pieces. If you look at the color system, why are they different colors? Also play tested, also something they had to figure out what will have lead people to have the best experience with Tetris they can. Oh, they should be bright and colorful. Oh, we should theme them, etc. That's a decision someone made. Internal scoring system, where do points come from? All of these are families of decisions that have to be made about a game as simple as Tetris. So even at that level, thousands of decisions are being made. And in modern AAA game development, every single one of those is tested in different varieties, different configurations, and different versions. That's where a lot of the cost comes from. So again, just a partial list, but these are your basic kind of mechanics that you see in video games. Anytime you create a game, whether for selection or for entertainment, you have to make all these decisions. So, dynamics. This is how game mechanics emerge into experiences. So what dynamics emerge here? How do those systems work together? Because note, when I told you the names of the system, I said the rotation system. I didn't say what happens when you rotate in relation to other systems. What does that mean? So for example, piece movement system plus the piece preview system. So one of the things that happens here is you actually get a preview of the next piece, right? So a dynamic that emerges from that then is that because you have a constant pressure, because the piece movement system defines the tetrominos are constantly moving down the screen, and you also have a piece preview system, those interact together to change the experience people have with Tetris. There's two pieces of information to pay attention to. If you get rid of that, preview system, there's only one piece of information to pay attention to, what's following. So you've created double the amount of information to literally expend your kind of cognitive resources when trying to interact with this game. So that's a dynamic that emerges. Piece movement system plus the level system. In the Tetris, one of the most fascinating aspects of Tetris to me is that the better you're doing, the more that you play Tetris, the more it punishes you for your success. As you do better in Tetris, it gets faster and faster. As you do better in Tetris, it gets faster and faster, meaning that it's harder to play. You get increasingly challenged the further that you go. So that creates an increasing time pressure, where as you play, it becomes potentially less enjoyable. That's one possibility. Or you get invigorated by that challenge and want to keep playing more. It's another dynamic that emerges. So, the piece movement system plus the scoring system, you get more points for clearing 4 lines instead of 1. That simple rule means, well, now I need to prioritize thinking ahead. If you always got rewarded exactly the same amount for clearing 1 line versus 4 lines, there would be no reason to risk 4 lines, because you have to make decisions as you play in order to maximize the chances that you'll be successful. So those are dynamics. That's how these systems work with each other to create experiences. Importantly, you can't control this as a game designer. There's no way for me to say, oh, I want the game to be harder as you play. You can't do that. Instead, you have to change the mechanics and hope that the interaction between those mechanics leads to the experience you want. The next step of that then is the aesthetic. This is a taxonomy of aesthetics that's in the MDA framework, which describes all the different feelings and emotions one might target with a video game. This is, by the way, the same sorts of things you can target by gamifying assessment. If one of these is not your goal, then it's probably not a good place to use a game. We can create new sensation, new experiences for people, create narratives to draw people into stories. We can create fantasy so people can immerse themselves in fantastical worlds, enable social relationships through fellowship, curiosity through discovery, urge to overcome through challenge, expression and submission. All of these are potential emotions that one can have from the dynamics we talked about earlier. So, here, the game gets faster, right? I mentioned this earlier. We have the game getting faster as the levels increase, meaning that because we have this piece dropping system, because we have this piece preview system, people are now going to pay attention to 2 pieces of information. That increased time pressure then creates emotions in the person that is playing the game. Meaning, the full process here is that for any given video game, the goal is in order to create the dynamics you want that will lead to those aesthetics. That is game design. And that's why it's so complicated. Because that means if you want people to like your game more, you need to carefully define exactly, well, why? What aesthetic, what emotional resonance do we want people to have with it? What kind of experiences would lead to that? And then what can we actually control about the game in order to lead to those experiences? It's this backwards, back and forth, going back a huge number of times in play testing with many different user groups and types of users in order to figure this out. Not uncommon to have hundreds, thousands of individual play testers on these AAA titles, and having each of them put in hundreds of hours individually to give feedback on all of these systems. So just enormously complicated. You can use it in any game. This one is also probably pretty familiar, Scrabble. So what kind of mechanics and dynamics and aesthetics work here? I think one of the most telling, if you played Scrabble, is this idea of the triple word score. We love the triple word score. Triple word score is the edge of the board, because what that does is it encourages you to move out from the center. If all you did was stay stuck to the center, then in your high-powered competitive Scrabble games, which do exist, then everyone would stick right in the middle and just do endless 2-letter and 3-letter words in weird combinations. They would just stick right in the middle. It wouldn't be as fun. Having these high-value points on the outside of the board encourages you to move outward. So to make the game more exciting, to make it more visually appealing, which is kind of that emotional state we're going for, we have used these mechanics to encourage people to move out. And I guarantee you that was play tested. Different placements of all these different bonuses was changed in multiple iterative rounds of game design. So that, even for a game, again, seemingly as simple as this, a lot has gone into it. Many different decisions about how people will experience the mechanics that are being implemented and what kind of emotional connection they'll have to them. Now, what's interesting to me here in the assessment context is they're not necessarily opposed with measurement goals, but they can be. You take sensation. Sensation is all about brand new experiences. That's a common goal of gameplay. You want to excite the player through, oh, I get to try this new thing, this new thing, this new thing. Well, in most of our measurement models, a real common goal is that we have essentially a random draw of assessments from a universe of possible assessments. It's kind of the basic of classical test theory, right? So if we're trying to assess conscientiousness, then we need to have questions randomly drawn from a universe of conscientiousness potential questions and pick them at random and say, aha, I have all of these examples of conscientiousness. Well, for new experience, repeating things is not super fun. Doing the same thing 50 times is not an enjoyable experience. So games use variety and sensation as a target point by giving constant new stream and constantly changing experiences. That may be directly opposed to some core measurement principles. And maybe there's ways around that, but maybe there's not, as part of what I'm trying to explore. Fantasy is another. This was a real common problem for high stakes for a high-stakes gamified assessment. There were a bunch of gamified assessments right when that started where they'd say things like, you're not taking an employment assessment, it's a mission. You're going to slay some monsters. They put this whole like fantasy layer on top of what they're doing. And a lot of people react to that and say, I don't want to do that. I just want to get the test and get a job. Why are you forcing me through all this nonsense? So these may be opposed. And so this kind of like opposition appears in a number of places. It's not really well explored in the literature yet. We brought it up as being an issue. But I think that there are certainly situations where you can sabotage yourself by targeting aesthetics that are not good given other goals. So gamification. I've talked actually to this point about games, which is different. So gamification, where gamification came from is that businesses would see those things like $260 million to build Grand Theft Auto and billions of dollars in earnings. We need a piece of that. We need to get some of that success and that excitement and that entertainment from games. But we don't want to spend any of that money. We just want to get all the good stuff. So gamification came to create this idea that we could borrow ideas from games and use them to make things better somehow. It led to proliferation of the word game as a sales tactic. Right in the early stages of game-based assessment and game-based everything, which is probably 3 or 4 years ago, this was common. People would call things games that were not games. They would call things gamified that were not gamified. We define gamification as a design strategy where game elements are added to non-game context. And that's a variation on existing gamification definitions in the literature. In most cases, when people gamify, they use PBL. If you remember PBL, that's points, badges, and leaderboards. Points, badges, and leaderboards arguably the worst option for gamification. If you look at the list I gave you earlier of game mechanics, it's a huge range of things you can do to create targeted aesthetics, targeted emotional changes that you want in a person. To limit that entirely to points is just silly. That really doesn't take any advantage of what makes games exciting. I like this metaphor, or not metaphor, this example. If points were exciting, and you played Tetris, and you got 1 point for every line you cleared, would you have 10 times as much fun if I gave you 10 points? And the answer is, no, you wouldn't. You wouldn't care about that at all. The reason is because the reason points matter in games is because they symbolize something. They recognize accomplishment. They recognize completion. They're a record of being successful. That emotional connection, that aesthetic, is why people value points. So if you just add points to a situation, you say things like, oh, for every page in our assessment, you're going to get 1 point, and by the end, you're going to have 10. No one will care about that because it's not connected to anything real. There's no aesthetic that you're actually tying them to. Gamification is commonly done that way, which we define, or I define as being a rhetorical gamification, where you have this sort of invisible layer of gamification on top. You say, oh, you're beating monsters, and you're getting levels, and you're getting points, but there's none of the actual game design processes being used. There's no aesthetic being targeted. It's just this blind application of game-sounding concepts. And that is often not only ineffective, but possibly counterproductive. You actually it converts something into something else. Your commonifications, complexification, make something more complicated. Gigantification, make something bigger. Jellification, make it jelly. Some of these are really interesting. I think like cognification is a word used in IT in order to make systems smarter. So ification, regardless of the specific context, it's about making something into something else. It's getting the characteristics of something. Gamification is about giving the characteristics of games to something else. It is not itself a product. It is not an outcome. I don't say, here, look at my gamification. That makes no sense. That's like saying, look at my survey design. No, the survey is the outcome of the survey design. So when you gamify, that's the process of changing something into something else. So, as a process, not an outcome, not a measurement method, it's a way to make things more gameful. So gameful is this, what we're calling, or we called in our research, this feeling that you get when you're playing a game. That you have sort of bought into these game rules, you jumped inside the magic circle, you're like, this is a game. And when you gamify, the goal is to bring some of that feeling to the person encountering the system. Most common in performance management. People have been gamifying performance for a long time. If you go all the way back to sales performance, and they had leaderboards in the office and that kind of thing, that's gamification. Nobody called it that though. But that's the basic idea. That you're trying to attach some kind of value and then recognize it. That's very much a game element. Whether it's done effectively or not is a different question. When something is gamified, it may already have game elements. It's not by default that you're saying this is a non-game completely, but rather it may have some gamey characteristics. So what are, I keep saying game elements. What are game elements? What is adding game elements, making things gameful? That is these mechanics. So game mechanics are the game elements that one adds to a system. And these, again, this is just a set of examples. Game mechanics can be anything included in what you would commonly recognize as being a game. So like the piece rotation system in Tetris, that's a game mechanic. You could use something like that if you thought that was interesting. What that means, and where you should go back to then, is that this is like a smorgasbord of potential options. That when you gamify, it's not just points, badges, and leaderboards, it is a huge universe of potential game things you could do. Meaning that statements like gamification is effective, gamification is not effective is a totally flat, meaningless sentence. It's like saying, oh, surveys are effective. Well, it depends on what you did in the survey. It depends on how you designed it. It depends on a lot of other factors. The same issue here. So, brings me to a common question I hit in this space. Is a situational judgment test a game, gamified, or neither? Specific text of this doesn't matter. I pulled it off a random site on the internet. It is your basic SJT, meaning there is a situational prompt, and then asks you, what would you do in this situation? Some SJTs, you choose one. Some SJTs, you rate how effective each would be. Doesn't really matter. Is this a game? So, game, remember, is play with rules. Is there a sense of play when you take an SJT? Probably not. I would not call this a game. Is it gamified? So, again, gamification is a process, meaning did you start with something and give it more game-like characteristics? In this case, this was probably written this way. It was written as an SJT item, so it was not gamified. You could gamify it, though. So a common way to gamify SJTs right now is branching. The idea that you can actually add narrative, a game mechanic, to an SJT to make it more engaging, relevant, and personal. So you can gamify an SJT, but an SJT is not by definition gamified. That distinction clear? Okay. So yeah, so the answer here is neither. So we've, in order to try to provide some organization to all of this, we've coined a term that I like a lot, which is game thinking, which is this idea that sometimes we gamify, sometimes we have games, but that whole idea of taking lessons from games and using them somehow, we call it game thinking. So this is the broader term. Game thinking appears in a lot of different ways, and we can see examples of games and gamification in all areas of iOS ecology, especially. In selection, we have standalone assessment games, which I'll talk about a lot today. We have gamified assessment, which I'll also talk more about today, where we actually have either a standalone game that one plays in order to get useful information about job candidates, that's a game, or we have gamified assessment, where we start with an assessment, we try to make it more gameful. We have the same thing occur in training. Serious games have been around for a very long time, that you can play a game to learn something. Gamified training, where you take an existing training and try to make it more interesting. We've done this with like PowerPoint-based training before. Worked with organizations that what they do for some type of training intervention is we give our employees 10 slides and they read them on a website. And we say that's not very interesting and why would people care about that? And you can gamify that to make it more interesting, more relevant, more personal. Performance, as I mentioned before, is also currently gamified. So, I'm going to go into selection specifically. So gamifying personality assessment. You should already at this point realize there's essentially an infinite number of ways to potentially do that. So we, instead of just looking at the full universe of possible ways to gamify, we instead ask some core questions. One, how do we use game elements to take an existing personality assessment and improve its aesthetics in some targeted way? We only have control over the mechanics of that experience, so what game mechanics are most likely to lead to improvement in target aesthetics? So if we have an assessment that we think is boring, for example, people don't like it because they are not very engaged with it, then what game mechanics can we use to create dynamics that will lead to an improvement in that reaction? Always follow that process. So whether game design or gamification, that core question is the same. So we were inspired by this app. Don't know who has used that before. Basic idea of this app is that if you like somebody and you want to date them, you swipe right. And you can see this card being swiped off to the right here. If you don't, then you swipe left. And if two people swipe right independently, then they are notified they have a match, and then they potentially go on whatever the modern version of a date is. So we saw this and we're like, oh, that's not a bad kind of interface. It has some nice characteristics that might make something a little more fun. So we said, I wonder if we could present personality items that way. What would happen if we had a card-based system I love the title of this, Swipe Right on Personality. It's a paper under review right now. What would happen if you took that and you swipe right to say, this is like me, or you swipe left to say, this is not like me? So we project with Nathan Widener, who's at Missouri S&T. So I wrote the app so we could do this experiment to see how well does this perform. Can we realistically do personality assessment this way? Converted an existing personality inventory. It was Saussures mini markers, which we chose because it's adjectives, so that makes it easily adaptable to this interface. We looked at reactions to it on an MTurk study, 287 people versus a traditional kind of Likert type measure of personality. Currently under review, we are past one R&R, so just keep that in mind. It might change very slightly from what I tell you. We were making a knowing trade-off. Likert type measures are nuanced. You have a lot of detail that people can process and try to understand. They are really politomized representations of continuous score distributions, meaning that there's not just 5 levels of personality in a 5-point question, but rather there's a continuous distribution of personality, and we just are asking people to rate where along this are you. So that's, even though there's 5 possible values, it represents a larger continuum. You use complete sentences, which is an important feature here, because it allows you to create a lot of detail and have people try to really reflect on how that swipe right, swipe left, that's it. That's all the only options you have. There's no neutral and there's no nuance outside of the neutral. 2 possible values and lacks a true 0, so those are important little considerations. What we know from any basic measurement is that when you do this, if I just took this 5-point measure and converted it into a dichotomized measure, you lose information. And losing information typically attenuates validities. You end up with, and reliability for that matter, you end up with not quite so accurate of a measure than you started with. So we knew that. We knew that up front. We would have less information in a dichotomous measure than we would in a 5-point. So that means we're probably going to need more items. So a core issue here then is a swipe-based measure worthwhile given its gains, such as reactions or marketing value, even the ability to say we have gamified measures is potentially valuable as a sales approach. Does that outweigh the lost information? Or can that lost information be recovered if you just have enough items? So if we have a 10-item, for example, Likert type measure, how many items do we need of our dichotomous measure that's a little different in order to get at the same quality of information? Do we need 20? Do we need 30? Do we need 50? Now the trade-off being that you're swiping left and right. Each item presentation is like half a second, so you can go pretty quick through them, unlike the Likert type measure. So where is the trade-off? How do you actually balance those 2 out? How bad is the loss and how much better do people actually like it? So information quality, we look for type measure, which is IP-IP, I believe. Yeah, it was IP-IP, and versus our swipe-based measure on the Saussure. And we found that there's a pretty big discrepancy. In the case of intellect in particular, we needed 4 items to get alpha 0.07, 16 of the swipe-based, 12 versus 61 swipes in order to get to the same level of reliability with the 2 measures. So the biggest discrepancy is there. Some of these are a little bit smaller. So in extroversion's case, we need 5 Likert type questions to get alpha 0.9, 18 on the swipe-based measure. And 18 swipe-based items is still faster than 5 Likert type items. So you end up kind of with a similar balance there. Also looked at the correlations between the individual scales themselves, which is this is a multi-trait, multi-method matrix. I only gave you part of it though. These are the correspondence between the 2 different scales. And you can see some variation. Whereas extroversion, emotional stability, and intellect, whereas extroversion and emotional stability corresponded pretty well. It was a little bit weaker in the case of the other 3. Now we have multiple sources of variance here, because they are actually different measures. It's Saussure versus IP-IP, so keep that in mind. But what this really tells me is that we can get okay correspondence between them, and we possibly could even engineer a swipe-based measure to be basically identical in a measurement equivalence sense to another more traditional measure. We didn't do that, but it's what it leads me to think we could do as a future study. Did people actually like it better? No, not really. In fact, it was really mostly based on which one they experienced first. We actually had this was a within subjects counterbalance design. If they took the Likert type measure first, they tended to like that better. And if they took the swipe-based measure first, they tended to like that better. So that's not a super strong case, reactions-wise, which is fine. What we concluded from that then is that this kind of gamification, not automatically better. You lose some information, which we knew a priori, but people don't automatically like it better either. There is an important caveat to that. This is a comparison of kind of bare bones technology. So we didn't engineer a candidate experience in our measure. It was very just gray card that you're swiping on. So perhaps with a full kind of user experience design process where you make it nice and pretty and fun and bouncy and so on, you might be able to get better reactions out of it. But just our little version by itself, people liked it okay. They didn't like it any better or worse than the more traditional measure. We would conclude instead that transformative change requires transformative investment. If you want to have a gamified version of something be really effective and really popular, really well experienced, you need to invest in designing and developing it, which we did not do. So, big conclusion. Gamification doesn't automatically improve reactions, but even if that's not true, we seem to have similar measurement quality if well designed, and that means that if the marketing message of we have gamified assessments is important to you, which is something that I hear a lot, if that's important to you, then there may be a way using some of these kind of approaches where you could get there. So, yeah. So that's gamification. And I hope you saw the process. We took an existing measure, we made it more gameful by making a swipe-based interface, that's a game mechanic, that's swipe, in order to try to meet some objectives that we had with the measure. So that's gamification. That's a big contrast to game-based assessment, which again are these standalone experiences where the idea, they're designed around a core of gameplay. The idea that you go into the assessment, you're playing a game, and you get some good assessment data along the way of that gameplay. These are some common products in the market right now. Gamifying is Rebellion's cognitivity assessment. Dash Dash got a huge amount of press a number of years ago, and they've gotten a little quieter. Yellow Hook Reef by Arctic Shores, which is sort of a gamified Ravens sort of thing. And this is Pymetric's product. I don't have time or on camera want to talk about that. But these are really common games in the assessment space right now. I'm going to focus on this one, Gamify. The reason is because we looked at Gamify and said, I looked at it and I thought, this, if any of these is going to work, I think it's going to be Gamify. And let me tell you why I thought that. One, this is actually what Gamify is. It's a series of mini games that you complete. Many of them look an awful lot like traditional cognitive ability assessments, but with interactive and some other gameful components. This is probably the most gamey. This is called shortcuts. The idea is that you are trying to find the most efficient path. It's like golf to the endpoint for a marble. And you have to figure out, well, do I move other marbles out of the way? There's one-way paths. There's a lot of complexity to it. So this is probably the most gameful. We have this one right here where you're taking an existing sort of 2D shape, and you're asked to construct a rotated version of it with tiles, which is a very classic sort of visual spatial 2D task. This one you have a target score. It's essentially a GRE quant. You're asked to look at each of, this one's GRE quant. This one is where you send a target number and different algebraic equations appear, and you're asked if it agrees with that with that answer, click on it. So this says 7, so if you see a 5 plus 2, you need to click the bubble. If you see a 5 plus 3, don't click the bubble, and you can make mistakes in both directions by missing bubbles you should have clicked and clicking bubbles you shouldn't. This is just a block puzzle. The idea is trying to get these pieces in to fit into a target space. This is our GRE quant question, where you're asked, is this side larger or smaller than the other side, or are they equal? And answer correctly. There's a time limit attached to that, and as you play, they get more complicated and harder. And this is a Stroop task, if you know basic psychology, but psychological research I should look very familiar. So yeah, this is kind of this mini game suite that people play. Each game is 5 minutes or less, so they're very quick independently. I thought Rebellion was really unique in the assessment game space because they take what we have termed a theory-driven approach to game development. So most of the other major vendors, the other ones that I just showed you, at the time that we looked into this, most of them use what I would call a data-driven approach, where they will use machine learning approaches to try to get interesting information out of the assessments, and they're not necessarily designed around constructs. Gamify was. Literally, when I emailed them and I said, how did you develop this thing? They sent me this PDF of the Cattell-Horn-Caro model of cognitive ability, and they said, this is what we based it on. We tried to look at this and say, which of these do you think we could make our best games surrounding which specific abilities? They said, so we targeted fluid reasoning, we targeted visual processing, and so on, and we tried to build a game, build each mini game targeting one of those, informed by both the research literature on that specific ability and the research literature surrounding the experience itself that we were thinking about. So like in the case of the Stroop task. So, for me, I said, if any of these are going to work, If any of these assessment games are going to measure what they claim they're measuring, if they're going to be valid, it's probably going to be this one, and I want to find out. So we ran a study, 2 simultaneous recruitment efforts, undergrads in psychology for extra credit, undergraduates across our entire university, and all, so it's not just psych students, for $20 a piece, and we incentivized the top 20 $100 to do the best they could across the assessment. 2 hours, they sat in a semi-controlled environment, and what that means is that everybody went to one of 2 rooms in the library on campus. The reason we did that is because we didn't want to have them come one at a time into our lab, and we really didn't want them to do it at home, where you have all sorts of technical differences in terms of what people's computers are capable of, their internet connections, and so on. So we tried to control that as much as we could, but still not have the study take 5 years. So that was the balance. Basic idea was a counterbalance within subjects. So we had half of the folks take the game-based assessment first, and then a battery of traditional cognitivity tests, and the other half did that in reverse order. They gave reactions measures every time. And we assessed cognitivity by looking at these 5 individual tests, which all have a pretty good history being used to assess those specific abilities. We also based it off of a chapter by Denise Owens and colleagues, where they actually categorized cognitive ability tests based on what specific ability the literature suggested that they were based on. So that's why that specific set was here. The reason we chose these 5 is because these are the ones Rebellion told us they were targeting. So these are the 5 traits that they said they were trying to get a good balance of. So results. In terms of reactions, it was universally positive, which really surprised me for reasons I will talk about in a second. Intrinsic test-taking motivation, much higher. You can see the d-values over here and standard deviations difference between game versus non-game. Test motivation was a little bit higher. Test anxiety was lower. People felt less anxiety taking the test doing when it was a game-based version. Distributed procedural justice. These are questions related to, do you believe it would be fair if you were to use this for employment? And those were responded to more positively to the game than they were to the cognitive ability test battery. Job relatedness, do you think this is related to your future job performance? More people responded positively to the game for that. And test propriety, which is my favorite, which is, do you think it would be appropriate for a business to use this as an assessment tool? Also more positive for the game-based assessment. So in general, they liked it a lot better. These were undergrads, so that's a key piece here. But they did generally like this better than the cognitive ability test battery. I have some theories as to why that might be. We'll visit that if we have time. Construct validity of latent general cognitive ability. So we used 5 tests. Our goal wasn't to look at correspondence with like one cognitive ability test. We wanted to look at a latent cognitive ability, general cognitive ability factor. So this is just your basic CFA to see if we have that kind of correspondence. Looks good. Also have a correlation between general cognitive ability and GPA, which is reported from university records, not self-report, actual GPA, of 0.299, which is actually really close to the meta-analytic estimate for the relationship between general cognitive ability and GPA. So successful, we have a cognitive ability measure. The next question then was, do we have a latent game performance measure? Are we measuring one latent characteristic with all these mini games that they played? This did not fit so well. We have some, it's okay, but not the requirements of classical test theory. Like, there's no reason to think that each game is a random draw from a universe of games. They were all designed. They were all independently created for different purposes. So we said, well, what do we have to do in order to get fit here? We found that if we tied these games together in various patterns, this is all modification of the C stuff, that we can end up with a decent level of fit. Not surprising, you can always do that in a CFA. But what's interesting is that some of these are a little more conceptually related. The paths that ended up being the biggest problems were when you had shared kind of cognitive approaches. There's more visual ones. The visual ones would tie a little closer together. When you had more numerical ones, they would tie a little closer together. We then took that model, which is now over here. It's really late in the day for SEM, so I'm sorry about that. This is that model I just showed you, where we're looking at latent game performance. This is the cognitive ability model. Correlation between the two, as you might be able to see, is 0.968 between latent game performance and latent cognitive ability as measured by the test battery. So we took that as pretty good evidence that this is, in fact, a cognitive ability test. Now, this piece is important because that means it's not just a cognitive ability test. We're also capturing something else, and it's not quite clear what that something else is. So that means we wanted to next investigate the composites. If we just look at the average across all the games, how does that compare to the average across the cognitive ability test in predicting outcomes? And we found we had incremental prediction in both directions, meaning we got incremental prediction of GPA by looking at game-based assessment beyond cognitive ability and in the reverse direction. Why that is our next problem to solve. I'm not totally clear on why. There's a bunch of possibilities. My favorite explanation right now, which I have no evidence for, so keep that in mind, is that we are actually getting in the game-based assessment sort of expressed cognitive ability. This idea that they're engaging in real activities using cognitive ability. We're capturing almost like a cognitive ability by situation interaction. How do you apply your cognitive ability in interactive situations? It's a common element of modern cognitive ability testing, like we do in like the Wechsler these days, but we don't really have in the paper and pencil measures that we gave. That's all, stare at a piece of paper and write in your answer, which we did online. It's the same basic idea. So maybe we're getting better information about cognitive ability, maybe not. We're also losing, we also have slightly better prediction the other direction too, so cognitive ability still gives you more information about GPA than the game does. I think that might be because of those patterns over here, that we're actually kind of misbalancing by having multiple pieces of information about each specific ability in that model. So we're getting, in these scores, visual processing is represented in several different ways, and quant is represented in several different ways. It's kind of like an unoptimized composite. So I think that's what's going on here, but we just don't have the research designed to give any more conclusions about that at this point. But that's where I'm led to believe, and what I want to investigate next. We also looked at black-white differential prediction. So one of the questions here, of course, and something I hear in the market a lot, is that by using game-based assessment, we will somehow magically get rid of adverse impact. That's something that is promoted. There's a couple of products out there, for example, that say they have unbiased assessment as a result of their games. And we found that there is no real difference between the two. We have the same pattern right here that you would expect in a general cognitive ability test. We have an intercept difference. We have over-prediction of black test takers from a shared regression line and under-prediction of white test takers. That's what happens in cognitive ability testing, and this is actually the graph from the game-based assessment. It's exactly the same. And this difference is about 0.8 standard deviations, which is about what you would expect. So it's a cognitive ability assessment, at least, maybe an imperfect one, but it is a cognitive ability assessment, and that shares all those characteristics. One of the things that I really push back very strongly on, which is a common issue in the people who make these kind of tests, game thinking of any sort, game-based assessment or gamification, can't remove adverse impact. It just doesn't make sense. If you don't have adverse impact in your game-based assessment, one of two things has happened. One, you're measuring different constructs, or two, that you are actually measuring it poorly. The best way to have a fair assessment is to have it completely unreliable. The most fair assessment you can imagine is to pull names out of a hat, right? So the more fair that more that you are able to predict an outcome that is itself biased, like GPA, then the better you predict it, the more bias there's going to be in your own measure. So that means the problem is in the outcome, the problem is in the construct, the problem is not in the method. That's not to say that you can't add it. So if we have take in mind, let's talk a little bit about the games literature regarding gender. Right now, more women play video games than men. Okay, accept that as a premise. More women play video games than men. They represent a larger portion of the market. The reason is because most people don't consider mobile games, right? So if you think about Candy Crush, if you think about Clash of Clans, you think about all these little mobile games, when you include that in the video game pie, you have more women playing video games than men. Okay? What's different then is genre. The kind of games that people play differ pretty dramatically. Women tend to favor puzzle games, tend to favor relationship-oriented games, social games. Men tend to prefer, on average, and the difference isn't huge, but it's big enough, tend to prefer things like first-person shooters, tend to prefer interactive real-time strategy. There's these differences in terms of gender. So that means if you build something that targets a genre that is favored in one direction or the other, you're likely to create adverse impacts because of familiarity effects. So if, for example, I had somebody come in and play Call of Duty, and I somehow retro-engineered Call of Duty into becoming, which is a first-person shooter game, engineered that into becoming an assessment, I would expect men to do better because, on average, men have more experience with those types of games. So you can create adverse impact in these situations if you're not careful. I think in this case it didn't happen because they were looking at a purely point-and-click kind of interface. This is a mobile puzzle game where you're just tapping on the answer that you want, right? So there's no real reason to expect gender differences in that context, but you very well could create a game where there were some. So don't take this in either way. Games, it's a method in the same way that We don't want to say that, in the same way that the method does not contribute directly to the adverse impact of a measurement here, the construct is the main cause. But you could engineer it. You could have items, just like on a survey, you could have individual items that perform differentially by some group that you were interested in. So it all depends on the design process and the construction. All right. So, conclusions from all that. Undergrads at least like this. More intrinsically motivated, believe it's more fair, believe it's more appropriate for job applications. So that's promising, that's good. They are undergrads, don't really know how well that matches up to the real world just yet, and real world applicants. We did do a cross-validation study with a large multinational consumer goods manufacturer, and found that the validity is still there. These are correlations between supervisory ratings of job performance and scores that came out of the cognitive ability assessment, 0.29 for their overall score and 0.4 for their numerical reasoning score that came out of the game. So we saw that in this validation study, we did predict performance. I don't know how well they liked it though. We didn't have the flexibility to add reactions measures to that study. So it does still, in this context, operate like a cognitive ability study, or cognitive ability measure, but I don't know if those people liked it as much as the undergrads did. So need to look at that further. At least this assessment was designed reasonably effective. Very important, and I mentioned it a couple times, not to avoid what I call the Arthur Villado trap. It's a great paper. It's about distinguishing between selection, predictors, and methods. We can't, for example, validly say interviews predict job performance. Instead, it's interviews of particular types. It depends on the way you designed the interview. It depends on the kind of questions you're asking. It depends on the environment that you're using. It's a method. The interview is a method to get information about candidate characteristics. Similarly, and surveys too. So similarly, a game is a method. It's a way to get information. It is not itself a source of information about job candidates. I think it can be designed and refined to meet kind of your classic measurement assumptions, whether you take a CTT or an IRT kind of approach. I think that you could refine it, and I think we could get a classic-looking psychometric measure out of this thing. That's something that we're working on right now also. Appears to behave similarly to a G measure, although we get that those extra pieces of information. It's not super clear where those pieces of information are coming from or what they are. And the differential prediction appears similar. And if you don't have if somebody tries to sell you a cognitive ability assessment game that doesn't have differential prediction, then that most likely means it's not measuring cognitive ability. So they're measuring the construct that they claim to be. As a general conclusion to all of that, I think that gamified and game-based assessment offer just a lot of unrealized potential. I really struggled over the word frontier in the title of this presentation because it seems awfully overblown, but I think it really is. There's a lot we can do with this that we haven't explored yet as the technology gets cheaper and cheaper to develop games, which has come down incredibly over the years. You can develop a game on your own computer for about 2 hours of effort now if you want to have a really basic game and use free tools to do so. As that gets lower to do professional quality games, I think we're going to see even more potential. Game-based assessment can be predictive and may even in some cases be preferred to traditional measurement approaches. Need more research though. Gameplay could be designed to be reflective of psychological characteristics that are difficult to measure. I imagine things, for example, like game-based assessment where we put somebody through a situation where they're required to engage in leadership behaviors and have them actually enact those in the same way we might do in a role play or an assessment center or some more interactive in-person version, and do that successfully in a game-based environment. Still more research needed there too. And with gamification, I think it can be used to improve assessment successfully, but may bring unexpected costs. And when we see folks that don't have expertise in assessments trying to gamify, I think that's where the biggest risks are. There's a bunch of companies that I've talked to that are doing things like, well, we just wrote some random questions and then we presented them as a game, and now we recommend to companies to use that for hiring purposes. And I say, wow, there's a lot wrong with what you just said. And there's a lot of little questions there that are unresolved and need further investigation. And there's also a bare level of expertise in both games and in assessment that are needed to come together to really create the real potential, I think, for that method. So all of that together is cautious optimism. That's my final viewpoint. That I think there's so much we could do if we invest in it and if we're careful about it from both the assessment and the game design perspectives. That's it. Thank you.
So, leave some time for some Q&A here. I suspect, given the topic, there'll be questions. No, I'll ask a lot of questions.
Yeah, ask about the CFA second model, the game-based
Yeah.
model. So how many items do you have on average for each of the, the rectangles? Because
Oh.
I wonder if we can model it with bi-factor model and just remove the modification indices altogether.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. So the challenge with item by item information is that items are not sequentially presented in the game. So in the bubble one, for example, where you're able to click on the math answers, the equation answers, you may have a bubble appear with a potential question to respond to, and then another bubble appear and start shaking and disappear before you've even responded to the first one. And they occur in random orders, and it's a little bit algorithmically driven, where there's not a single order of bubbles that appears. So it's really hard to actually decompose the game into individual measurement events in the same way that you would a traditional assessment. If we ignore that, we could do that. So I may do that. That's an interesting idea.
So
Yeah.
when, I know Gamify has this, I think we talked briefly about it before, this word
Yeah.
grammar test. Did you use that one at all or no?
That was, I think.
Oh, it was one of the ones where I
Yeah.
just didn't see it?
Yeah, that's
The one in the bottom corner.
proof it. This one.
Oh, I see. You just didn't show an example of it.
Yeah.
I see. I got you. Okay.
And that nice 2x3 matrix.
Yeah, I
image.
got you.
Yeah. 7 is hard to present. Yeah. So yeah, that's their full set. At least as of when they did this, I think they've added 1 or 2 since we did the site.
Other questions or comments?
Do you think the preference towards games or gamification has to do with just novelty? This is not what they expect, and if so, how long that novelty would last?
Yeah. So that's a question we really were interested in, only to discover there is no well-validated measure of novelty perceptions. We've, as a first step in trying to figure that out, we have been trying to develop one, because that is a big question. I think that as soon as you encounter, that folks that encounter things they haven't seen before, you can make an argument in both directions, that because it's unfamiliar, they say, wow, it's not fair, this company's assessing me with this thing I've never seen before. I mean, we see that with traditional psychometric assessment sometimes, and the big kind of pushback against personality testing that's starting to like weirdly bubble up in places. I think it was the whole state is trying to ban personality testing now, right? Yeah. So as people become more familiar with it, there's arguments in either direction as to whether that's good or bad. And even based on applicant reactions theory, I think you can piece that down to familiarity and knowing what to expect would be good, so a game would be bad, but also feeling that you have, it just being more interesting in general might be good. One of the things that I've spent some time thinking about, and I referenced it a little earlier. So when you're completing these assessments, you get feedback about your performance from these in a way that you don't get in a traditional psychometric assessment. And I think that might contribute in part to this. So when you do a psychometric assessment, whether it's personality or cognitive or whatever else, you traditionally don't know how you did on previous questions, right? And when we do have computer adaptive tests that give very obvious information, like the questions get harder means I'm doing well, people interpret that. Like they see that information, they're like, oh, the questions are getting harder, I must be doing great. Oh, the questions are getting easier, I'm a failure and I'm terrible and I'm getting bad. The GRE had this whole struggle a number of years ago. In the game, you actually see what you're doing to some degree. Like you can say, oh, I clicked on these or I didn't click on these, and you get kind of an immediate pieces of information about your performance in a way you don't in other approaches. At least based in Gamifying, that's not by default something part of game-based assessment. And I think it's easier to fool yourself in this assessment that you've been doing well than it is the cognitive ability test pattern. Because you get that some degree of feedback, like you're doing great, because oh, my score went up. Like you see, but you don't have any standard by which to know what a good score is. So yeah, I think there's a lot of ambiguity, and yet you get feedback that would lead people to have a more positive response in that dimension. Whether that would disappear as these became more common or not, I don't know. But yeah, that's where I am on it.
Did you look into like educational games as well when you were researching this?
Yeah. So, well, most of the assessment that occurs in educational games is done kind of formatively, where you're actually trying to provide feedback to students as they're learning on what they've learned. Like the focus is almost entirely on learning outcomes, on knowledge. And there's some really interesting research. It's used all sorts of games coming out of Valerie Schute's work, who's at somewhere in Florida, I think, where she's used Plants vs. Zombies 2, a mobile game, in order to assess problem-solving ability in kids. So I think it's similar. Those groups haven't really talked to each other. We're actually in the final stages of getting a NSF grant approved with a workshop on game-based assessment. We're bringing in education researchers and also IO types and also assessment people. So I'm hoping to I'm hoping to address some of those issues by bringing those groups face to face. But yeah, we're aware of it. It's just there hasn't been a lot of direct interaction between them so far. Yeah.
So, one question that we get often is about dropout rates, and so it seems logical to me that in these game-based things, dropout rates would be lower. I don't know if you have any information on that at all, or does anybody know anything about that?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I hear that a lot too. That would require a company that has introduced game-based assessment to let us into an awful lot of data. So I would be happy to answer that question, but it depends on the availability of organizational data to test it. Yeah, nothing available that I know of.
From an IT perspective, like we see some people that are applying for jobs that take a lot of these top cognitive assessments used. Maybe I lost my internet connection or it dropped me in the middle of it as an excuse for me to get back to work. How do you take that into account?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this company, the advantage of the mini-game approach is that, and the advantage that they all provide sort of not equal quality, but similar information about general cognitive ability, means if somebody drops out in game 3, you can just remove game 3 from their score and include games 4 through 7 and have them come back and take them later, and still get a pretty good estimate of what that score should have been. So that's part of why they designed it that way. Whereas when you have like linear experiences, that would absolutely be a problem. So if you were literally in one linear game experience for like 45 minutes, and you say, oh, minute 45, something went wrong, oh well, and you have to redo the entire thing, that would be a problem. So I think it depends on design. Yeah. Finding assessments and folks that are creating these, prioritizing this kind of like compartmentalized experience, I think is really important for that reason.
Okay, I think we'll let you go. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.